Hi, welcome to Project Matrilineal's podcast series. Today we're excited to host a very special guest, Professor Siobhan Mattison, who's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico. Professor Mattison is also the director of the Human Family and Evolutionary Demography Lab, also known as HFED. We believe that her outside perspective on evolution, behavioral ecology, and kinship as it relates to the role of women in society is going to make for an engaging and informative session. This podcast is split into 4 different segments, and this is the first. We hope you enjoy it. Good afternoon, Professor Mattison. It's so wonderful to have you on the podcast series for Project Matrilineal.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you bring a really diverse perspective as a renowned anthropologist with a focus on human behavioral ecology and evolution, I believe it is.
Thank you. That's exactly right.
Yeah, your research on kinship, especially matrilineality, parenting, social inequity, and demography are particularly interesting in this context of our mission and on this podcast series. We've had guests from Indigenous cultures previously, so I'm really excited to bring your outside perspective to the audience.
Thank you. I really appreciate being here among such a well-curated set of guests too. So thanks very much.
Before we begin, I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourself. I know I may have glazed over many important aspects of your experience and your background.
Yeah, where to start? I don't know. I guess I'll try to keep it limited to the professional side. I'm a behavioral ecologist. As you mentioned, I got my undergraduate degree at Cornell University, where I think I wanted to be either a psychologist or a biologist for a long time. And then I ended up taking this course in neurobiology and behavior that was taught by a lot of really interesting, charismatic, and thoughtful people. And got sort of hooked on the theoretical side of what they were doing and ended up going into anthropology, using some of those same perspectives to think about humans, but expanding beyond the biological side of things by really focusing on how variation in human culture affects how people behave and where evolution sort of fits into that whole thing.
Did you start there first and then move toward human evolution that you do now?
Yeah, I started in biology. I got my undergraduate degree in biology, actually working with honeybees. So not on humans, but I've always been really interested in questions surrounding, men and women and boys and girls, and why sometimes they seem to have, why sometimes especially boys are preferred over girls and things like that. And when I went to graduate school at the University of Washington, that was the question I wanted to pursue. I really wanted to understand this variation in when boys were preferred over girls and when the opposite might also happen. And so that's basically what I spent my graduate sort of dissertation doing. And then I went on to Stanford University for a postdoc in demography and anthropology, looking at issues of sun bias, parental investment. We call it sun bias parental investment, but sex bias in Asia for a year. And then by a kind of circuitous route, ended up where I am now, which is at the University of New Mexico in the evolutionary anthropology wing. And I am an associate professor there leading a lab that does sort of variations on similar kinds of things.
That's amazing. I'm very grateful to have such a well-educated perspective like yours today. So thank you very much for sharing more about yourself and your experience. As a starting point, could you shed some light on what made you gravitate toward your field of study? I know you kind of touched on that a little bit, but what interested you, I guess, is kind of what I'm asking.
Yeah, I don't know, there's always something personal in people's trajectories, I think, if not always, often. And I think in my case, I grew up in a family that was pretty large. I had 3 older brothers and 1 younger sister. And from my perspective, as one of the younger girls, I think my parents would probably disagree with this, but I felt that the boys were treated better. at least differently than the way the girls were treated. And so there was always this kind of lingering issue of um, why there was this kind of subtle preference in my family. And it, to be honest, I think the ways I felt it, it was often really subtle, like that somebody would be deemed better for some sort of intellectual activity over somebody else. These small things that you would feel in any large family, but for whatever reason, that's the way I felt about things, and that's sort of what um, pushed me into this area of interest. So I think for a long time I thought I was going to be like a psychologist, actually, even though in high school and stuff like that I had been really strong in biology. I had always gravitated toward it. It was like a subject that I just adored. Um, so I don't know, you'll go to college next year, the year after, I forget.
Next year.
Next year. You'll see, early on in your college career, you take a lot of courses and it takes a while to really narrow in on what you want to do. And I'd been taking courses in psychology and some in biology, and then I landed in that course. And the way that they presented these questions about animals just really resonated with me. It's like something that took a lot of different patterns and then tried to explain them from some kind of overarching framework. And I was really attracted to that sort of theoretical underpinning for what I think in psychology sometimes ends up being a lot of patterns that are really interesting but hard to explain from one, again, overarching sort of framework.
Yeah. What do you think the most important contribution that human behavioral ecology brings to us today? Or kind of, I guess, how does it help us understand our evolution and kind of where we've ended up today, evolving from the past?
That's a great question, and it's not an easy one to answer. Human behavioral ecology is a discipline that has that I think offers some really positive contributions to understanding the flexibility, the range in human behavior, and really understanding that humans are remarkable in some ways in how flexible we are to adjust our behaviors to different kinds of circumstances, but equally that humans are not fully divorced from their biology. And I think that's really important um, because if you can explain what drives people to do certain things, then, whatever your political perspectives are, that's how you build the kind of leverage that you might need to um, design the right interventions and things like that, right?
Yeah.
So I'll give you one example, of a difference in approach to that based on behavioral ecology and like public health, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a great example of this is teenage pregnancy in the United States. For the most part, when people think about teenage pregnancy from a public health perspective, we often think of that as a negative thing and as an outcome of something like poverty, and we might kind of even stigmatize it a little bit from the public health perspective because we're trying to do things that push people into different directions. And I think a behavioral ecology perspective doesn't put that value judgment on it right from the outset. Instead, we would ask, what are the conditions that make it seem like a reasonable thing to do biologically to have your child when you're a teenager, whatever those circumstances are that make that what we would call kind of a strategy, but make it a reasonable thing, a reasonable way to kind of behave in the sort of circumstances that you're in. And once we understand what those factors are, we know whether or not it's something that makes sense to change and what the levers are to change it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So teenage pregnancy in the United States is very different from teenage pregnancy in other parts of the world. It means one
Mm-hmm.
thing when you're doing it by yourself and you don't have much support, and it means something really different if you have, say, your grandmother, your maternal grandmother around to help out, right? And then it's can be quite traditional in certain cases. So I think we have a more outside the box perspective on issues like that. And I think we have a lot to contribute in those ways.
Wow, that's a very intriguing field to study. I've learned a lot just from talking to you for these few minutes. I'm kind of curious, what's your favorite research area in this? Because I know it's a huge umbrella.
Oh gosh, that's a hard question. I feel like sometimes my research is a little bit all over the place, but if I had to sort of summarize it in a couple of different areas, I guess it really is about family structure, variation in family structure, and what that means for the people who are parts of those families, and what that and the differences in those things, those interlinkages across different kinds of societies. So I kind of come from this perspective that I think a lot of behavioral ecologists do, where I think we shouldn't overgeneralize from Western societies. We shouldn't assume that everybody looks like people do in the United States. I want to really understand what the variation is across different societies with respect to things like how we build our families and what that means for people's development and well-being.
Well, that's wonderful. I think there's some really very interesting branches within that. I know you mentioned that your lab that you lead. I don't think we touched too much on that. That's a fascinating project. I think that could be such a great resource for those who are interested in the field. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Thank you. Yeah, I guess the lab is kind of titled after what we're interested in, which is human family and evolutionary demography. So again, just trying to think about um, how evolution might be able to explain some of the variation that we see in human families across space and time. Um, and the students and postdocs in the lab pursue various questions that relate to that. My interests recently have been very strongly in the area of gender, as you know. So a
Yeah.
lot of maybe all of the students and postdocs that have come through there have had kind of a fairly strong focus on gender too, actually. Um, and maybe that's not an accident. Like it's hard to study families without thinking about gender, right? It's such a core part of everything. So, but there's a lot of difference. There are a lot of different projects that the students might pursue. We've had students that have been interested in, like one right now is doing a project on social networks. Again, with this Chinese population, the Moso, and trying to understand how much they rely on kin versus on people that aren't their kin, and whether that is affected by economic development and stuff like that. We have another student who's just started recently who's interested in organ transplants, actually, in Bangladesh and in India. And apparently, he's interested in the role that gender plays in that. So often, according to what he's told me, um, women are donating, for example, kidneys to male family members. And he wants to understand why that might be the case and whether that's changing as parts of Bangladesh and India are becoming more market integrated and stuff like that. So, um, yeah, we just support all sorts of any research really in those kind of broad themes we support, but a lot of them have been focused on gender to date.